I'm here to talk to you about the consulting project, which you're going to need to perform in groups later this semester. So here's an actual consulting project or case that I used with my students in the summer of 2017. So VAC and vaccine were new parents of their first child, wanting to do everything right. They had heard some of the evidence about vaccines, increasing the risk of autism, but they also had heard from their pediatrician, who strongly recommended vaccines and their daycare that required them. And they wanted to know what the research said. Should they give their children vaccines? So, where does this come from? Part of where it comes from is this massive increase in diagnoses of autism, or I'll sometimes refer to this as ASD, autism spectrum disorder, over the last 20, 30 years. During a period, so that's our red line, during a period when other disabilities have remained relatively stable. So what we're interested in is vaccinations. That's our independent variable. And when there is a randomized controlled trial, we're also seeing a comparison with a control group or research with control group, and particularly research that uses a placebo. Our dependent variable is a diagnosis with autism spectrum disorder. This research has primarily come out of Wakefield's study in 1998, where he, looking at a group of 12 children on the spectrum, and he noticed, he was primarily looking at gastrointestinal problems, but he noticed this relationship between autism and diagnosis and vaccination, and published that in a pretty respectable journal called The Lancet. The problem with the research is that it was pretty small sample size, so about 12. There was no control group. So we have no idea what children who did not receive a vaccination, what happened. And we also are here looking at research with retrospective recall rather than some sort of prospective study. So in Wakefield's research, he's asking these parents, what happened with your children that was unique 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago? And a much stronger kind of research would be to study these children over a period of years and notice when and under what circumstances there were changes. Much more difficult study, of course. As I said, the research was retracted, and I would encourage you to go and look at this original research and think about what some of the pros and cons are. It is available full text at the Lancet. So what kinds of things, what kinds of evidence might there be that there is a real problem? So I have two figures here. The bottom one shows the increase in autism or diagnoses of autism over a period of time. These are all in California. During that same period of time, we are seeing MMR immunizations increasing, but not increasing to huge degrees, and certainly not to the degree that we're seeing, in the bottom figure. One of the things we've talked about throughout the semester is this correlation between two different variables. Here is a correlation between autism and cell phone use. Certainly they have both increased during the same period. Probably none of us is going to argue that cell phones cause autism. Similarly, this graph shows an increase in autism and organic food sales, both increasing over the same period, and none of us are going to argue that eating organic food, or actually just selling organic food, increases the amount of autism or number of diagnoses. So the evidence. On the pro side is Wakefield's research that we've already been talking about. On the con side, saying no evidence for this relationship between autism and vaccines, is a whole barrage of studies, and I basically ran out of room, in this slide. We're looking at a variety of different countries. So we're looking at the US, Sweden, Denmark, Italy. We're looking at a variety of different kinds of studies. So in some, like in Tazi et al. In 2009, we're seeing random assignment, either getting MMR vaccine or a placebo, and following these children forward. We're seeing studies like Sturr-Green et al., where they're comparing autism spectrum disorder rates in California, Sweden, and Denmark. California was still using thimerosal, Sweden and Denmark not during these periods, and yet in all three locations we're seeing massive increases in ASD. I think Taylor et al. Is another study to look at. This is 2014 at the bottom of your slide, where we're seeing a variety of different studies, 5 cohort studies, such as described by Sturr-Green et al., using 1.2 million children and 5 case control studies involving almost 10,000 children. Either one, just huge, difference and large sample size. So if we're looking at Wakefield, there's some scientific evidence that's more convincing. Wakefield is at the bottom. He's, basically looking at or doing case report. The articles saying that there is not a relationship between ASD and vaccinations are at the top of this pyramid. They are the strongest. Meta-analyses. So for example, Taylor et al. Was a meta-analysis. Randomized controlled studies, cohort studies. All of these are what we're finding in the research described on the right in the last slide. So what other, it is pretty clear that we shouldn't be vaccinating, or that vaccinations, or that we should vaccinate. It is pretty clear that we should vaccinate. There is no evidence that vaccinations lead to increased cases of autism spectrum disorder. But here's something else that we should be thinking about. If we're looking at these two maps, both of Netherlands in 2013, we're seeing that the places where there are fewest vaccinations, so the darkest blue on the right map of the Netherlands, are also those places with the most outbreaks of the measles. What people often talk about in terms of immunizations is that they provide herd immunity. So the fact that one person or many people are immunized makes it less likely that the people who aren't immunized, aren't vaccinated, get the disease. This is particularly important for children who are unable to be vaccinated because of some sort of illness or some sort of immunosuppressive disorder. So my recommendations: no evidence that vaccines cause autism spectrum disorder. There is considerable evidence that vaccines do not cause autism spectrum disorder. Vaccines are now safe and always hypothesized to cause autism spectrum disorder. No mercury, no thimerosal in vaccinations, and hasn't been throughout the century. Finally, not vaccinating children puts immunocompromised children at greater risk. In other words, vaccinate your children. That's my recommendation to the scenes. One other thing so let's pull this out a little bit and think about what else we should be thinking about. I think we should be thinking about why Wakefield's original study was so influential to some parents, and why some parents were so readily convinced that vaccines are dangerous, and why, even as other evidence has come out, they've stuck by that hypothesis. Have a good day.